History as it happens, July 27th, 2021. The American Revolution and Religion.
And a country then was created by men and women who came not for gold, but mainly in search of God. They would be free people, living under the law with faith in their Maker and in their future.
American politicians invoke God when exalting our nation's place in history. From the Pilgrims to the founding, this story goes, America was founded a Christian nation. But this claim obscures a more complicated, a more interesting past, one that avoids simplistic debates about the role of religion during the American Revolution. That's next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
So what I see as the real lesson of the subject of religion and the revolution is that this conflict over whether the United States is a Christian nation or not, or the place of religion in our public life, it's an argument that's built into our DNA.
The next time you hear someone say America was founded as a Christian nation or that our laws are based on Judeo-Christian values, ask them if they've ever read Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli. It was ratified in the U.S. Senate in 1797. It says, as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. That was ratified when the Constitution was not even a decade old. John Adams was president. Now, you might say, I'm cherry-picking, taking facts out of context to make a point. I would say it's a bit odd that we Americans continue to argue about this, right? I mean, if the United States was founded to privilege one religion over all others, it should be easy to find such evidence in the Constitution or somewhere else. And here's another question. Why haven't we, after all these years, been able to settle how religious were the Founding Fathers? You also might ask, why does this matter anymore? Well, as we often say here, the past does matter. Our origin stories always matter. Who we were defines who we are today. But maybe this argument, whether the U.S. is or is not a Christian nation, misses a more interesting, even more important story of the founding. Most colonists were Christians. They were Protestants and belonged to established churches before the words separation of church and state entered the lexicon. And they viewed themselves as members of an empire, the British Empire, an arrangement ruptured by the Revolution that would redefine religious life in the new United States. Historian Katherine Carté is a specialist in colonial history at Southern Methodist University, and she takes a fresh look at this subject in her excellent new book, Religion and the American Revolution, an Imperial History. Katherine Carté, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with the reasons why you wanted to write this book. It is your specialty at Southern Methodist University, colonial history, but you're approaching it differently than, say, popular historians of the period would.
Yes, and the thing that really drew me to this project is actually one of the big differences between the way academic historians look at the American Revolution and the way popular historians do. So my training is as a colonialist. I worked before this project. I worked mostly in the 18th century before the American Revolution. And when we look at that period, we really look at the British colonies as integrated into the British Empire. So I was curious from the perspective of religious communities, of people who believed that they were part of the same spiritual fellowship, how they reacted to the coming of the war, what it meant for people from the same denomination on both sides of the Atlantic to be taking up guns and shooting at each other.
Most of the histories I've read, and I'm a fairly well-read person on this subject, deal with the political ideas of that time. But your scholarship and this book specifically deal with the religious ideas that were percolating at the time. And you also touch upon whether religious ideas, or to what extent religious ideas, motivated colonists to rebel, right?
Yes, absolutely. We've tended to look at religion as one of the things that contributed to ideologies of revolution. I think that does happen. But if we look sort of across the whole spectrum of people who were in the colonies, there were also people who drew on their faith to come to the conclusion that they should not fight against the British Empire. So it kind of cuts in all directions.
I find much of the current debate over the role of religion in the founding of the country to be somewhat impoverished, and we'll get into it a little bit later on, this question of whether the United States was founded as a Christian nation. Most colonists were Christians and derived their worldviews from the Bible or their congregational setting. But that doesn't mean they were trafficking in the same type of Enlightenment ideas or philosophies that some of the founders were, such as Thomas Jefferson. Ideas that were audible at one level of society, not necessarily audible at a different one.
Yeah, I think that's true, but we shouldn't underestimate the influence of the Enlightenment and the thoughtfulness of the people who are in the congregations. It is certainly true that most institutional religious life, so when people went to churches, they were going to Protestant churches. There were a lot of clergy people who were preaching ideas that stemmed from the Enlightenment. So there isn't this sort of conflict between the Enlightenment and religion that sometimes we like to imagine. They were pretty well integrated for folks. But you're right, absolutely, that the ideas we associate with deism, which of course isn't a church, it's more of an intellectual movement, those were pretty rarefied circles, not too many people involved in that.
So what were you hoping to accomplish with your book by introducing the reader to this concept of imperial Protestantism?
I think at the core, what I want people to think about is how disruptive and damaging the American Revolution was to religious communities. So the American Revolution is a break in an empire that people see in religious terms. So people in 18th century America and 18th century Britain thought that the British Empire was playing a role in providential history, that it was the vehicle through which God was bringing his plan to pass. And so when that empire ruptures, it really causes deep changes. It causes structural changes in the way established churches work. And it also causes real shifts in how people think about the governments that they're a part of. I mean, most basically, people in what becomes the United States have to decide that the American project, that the United States is the right thing to be doing, right? I wanted us to think about this moment not just as one of creation, but of one that's destruction and then creation, that we have to keep both halves of that together.
So it's a good segue. Why don't we go to the decades then before the Revolution? Let's say the 1750s. This is before the major crises between colonists and Parliament. Every colony, or almost every colony, had an established church, right? So what did it mean to have an established church in your colony? Because any American today has not lived under an established church.
That is absolutely true. So we tend to think of establishment in pretty simple terms. We tend to think of it as pretty much just the state funding a specific church. And in the 18th century, it meant a lot more than that. So it did mean that the state would fund a particular denomination, but it also meant that governments, and this would be both colonial governments and then also sort of the imperial government on top of that, were involved in church affairs in lots of different ways. For one thing, they have things like blasphemy laws. So if somebody is causing a religious problem, then it's the state's job to manage that. It's not the religious leaders who have to manage it. It's going to be the state that's going to come in and say, oh, if you're burning Bibles in the town square, it's going to be the state that says that's disruptive. The state would give a lot of authority and respect to clergy people. Religious leaders would speak at special events. We call this the public pulpit, right? So if the government needs, for instance, its wars to be interpreted as something that should be happening, when England goes to war against France, the clergy speak at the public pulpit and say that this is the right thing because the Protestant Empire is fighting the papist French, right? So you get these kind of collaborations at lots of different levels. And then there are differences between establishments in the different colonies. So most of the colonies have the Church of England established, but then there are colonies where you have the Congregational Church, which is sort of the post-Puritan church established. And then Presbyterians are established in Scotland, which of course is half of Great Britain. And so because the British Empire has these three different specific churches that receive this kind of government support, they all kind of have to work together. So the Protestant establishment is kind of the working together of all of these different groups.
And many of the conflicts didn't necessarily arise from theological disputes, or did they? Because you detail in your book when this or that issue would come up and how the churches and the government would deal with it. Often it didn't seem that they were debating the finer points of the scriptures.
No, not at all. You're exactly right. They fought about the exact same things that we fight about. They're fighting about money. They're fighting about resources. They're fighting about influence. And what's really important is all of those different denominations are deferring to the government to be the body in charge that's going to do the adjudication. They do argue about theology, but they do that in kind of a different space. That's like university professors of theology will be writing back and forth and writing tracts. They do argue theology, but it's not a political issue. And then in politics, they're arguing over things like who gets mission funding in what kind of space, or whether this particular minister is able to marry people or things like that. So it has much more to do with resources.
How did it affect someone's life if they were living in a colony and they weren't a member of that colony's established church?
That is such an important question, because it's so easy to think about the people who are outside of the establishment as persecuted or in problematic spots. But anybody who was part of one of these, what they would call loyal Protestant churches. So it's a political concept, right? So denominations that are loyal to the British Empire. If you're part of one of those denominations, you can pretty much go anywhere in the empire without any serious trouble. You might have little irritations, but you're not going to have serious trouble. The people who are on the outside of that system completely, if you want to found your own new religion, you're going to have trouble. If you want to have women preachers, you're going to have trouble. But if you're in one of these religious groups that are recognized in law, then you're not going to really have any serious trouble.
Catholics were not tolerated, or were they?
No. Well, in some places in the colonies, there are some safe spots for Catholics, but largely not. And that's because the Protestant Empire, Britain's Protestant Empire, was defined specifically against the Catholic French. And this is why Ireland is such a fascinating place. So Ireland as a British colony is held apart from this whole Protestant Empire thing because, of course, Ireland does have a majority Catholic population. Catholics are seen as not politically viable. I think this is a construct that resonates with people today. So the prejudice is that Protestants believe that Catholics have been given a dispensation from the Pope not to honor any oaths or honor their word if they're speaking to a Protestant. They only have to speak truthfully if they speak to other Catholics. And so what that means is that no Catholic oath of loyalty to the state can be trusted. They could never be legitimate citizens. But even when Catholics are around in some sort of physical way, they're not able to participate in public life because their word isn't considered trustworthy. They're not considered viable subjects.
The word popery appears in your book often, a word that no one uses anymore. But at the time, the Catholic Church was, well, detested by many people or feared.
Certainly by British Protestants. It's one of those words that I think in the 18th century, it would have been considered such a slur to use it. Certainly today, we're not used to hearing that at all. But popery is this idea of political and religious corruption, that Catholic papists are naturally slavish in that they don't have free will because Protestants understand liberty and Catholics don't understand liberty. It's associated with tyranny. It's associated with corruption. The other word would be Jesuitical. So the Jesuits are nefarious backroom actors that are undermining anything that's righteous and good politically. In the 18th century, a lot of these ideas are really powerful.
I want to return to one of your earlier points. I think one of the fables we're taught as children is that the early colonists, British colonists, came here seeking religious freedom or religious tolerance when, in fact, they formed their own fiefdoms that weren't all that tolerant at times. But you describe in your book there was this mixed establishment. There was, and you touched on this already a little bit, maybe we can go a little deeper now. In some instances, there was tolerance to a point.
Absolutely. Because Protestants in lots of different places were both invested in the idea that they had an establishment somewhere, right? So somewhere in the British Empire, their church is established, and because they're often in places where they're not established. You get kind of both things going on at once. You get really vibrant arguments for why you need an established state church that is ensuring, for instance, that everybody goes to public worship, that everybody has access to public worship. That's considered a basic function of government. On the other hand, you don't want to have anybody preventing anyone else from following their conscience. And so you get these arguments for religious liberty and arguments for religious establishment that are really kind of joined together. But what's important there is that they're all talking about the same kind of religion. They're all talking about Protestant denominations that are loyal to the state, that have male ministers that preach on Sundays and preach sermons that follow the same sort of pattern, even if they differ in theological points. They look a lot alike. And anybody who doesn't conform to that model including Catholics, that's not going to be included. So religious liberty doesn't extend to those people.
You mentioned there were religious laws in some of these colonies, but these weren't theocracies, right?
No, and that was really important to British Protestants. From their perspective, a theocracy would be a place where clergy are running the government. And there are often rules against clergy being in the government. They would consider that a sign of popery, honestly, or priestcraft would be the word they would use. And so the idea that you would have actually the church, an institutional body that has money and interests and things like that, running the state would be really problematic. So they keep separation there. But of course, everybody who's running the government is a part of the established church. They're members of the church instead of leaders of the church. So that's the distinction they would have made.
So during the latter part of the 1750s and then on into the 1760s, we have the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, and then the Stamp Act crisis. When it comes to the war, the churches see themselves as part of this empire. They're basically rooting for a British victory, right? They're not opposed to the war.
Oh, not at all. And this is from all different branches of the British Protestant system. They are vigorously supporting the British cause against the tyranny of popery. You know, there are wonderful sermons where British leaders say, you know, we need every denomination to pull together at this crisis moment. We can never talk about this enough. We have to all fight together. And they cheer for victories across the, you know, it's a war that goes on. Winston Churchill called it the First World War, right? It goes on all over the place. They cheer for victories across the board. People in Britain are rooting for victories in the colonies and vice versa, or in Europe. So they are very invested in that collectively. And, you know, at the end of the 7 Years' War, the colonists are more excited to be British than at any point in their history.
Before we get to the Stamp Act crisis, a couple more points about pre-revolutionary America. The churches saw the British victory in the French and Indian War as something that would benefit them, right? And would also have a major impact on the church's relationship with Native Americans and the enslaved too, right?
Absolutely. And I think one of the interesting challenges we have with the history of slavery and the history of empire and indigenous peoples is that we want religious leaders to be the one who are speaking out for what we see later on as the right path. But in the 18th century and the 17th century, religious leaders saw the opportunities of empire as opportunities of Christianization. So they work with the state and focus the attention of people who want to make the world better on the projects of missionizing enslaved people or missionizing indigenous peoples. And they don't offer a critique of the way the empire is relating to those people. So there's no systemic critique of slavery coming from the dominant religious groups or systemic critique of the seizure of indigenous lands. Generally, what they focus on is extending worship to those people, making sure that they have access to teachings of Christianity.
So the Stamp Act crisis, 1765, 1766, it's something that we all learn about in elementary school on up in the United States. Why did the churches stay silent during the Stamp Act crisis?
On balance, they're staying silent. So most Americans and most American religious leaders thought the Stamp Act was a terrible idea. But they were also largely uncomfortable with the violence of some of the Stamp Act protests. There are a few really important religious leaders who do speak out against the Stamp Act, but they do it usually in places where royal authority is pretty weak. So we're talking about places like Connecticut and Rhode Island that don't have royal governors. And they're doing it in careful ways. And then when the Stamp Act is repealed, then you see the full outflowing of antagonism against what had happened. But it's done in this way where they celebrate the repeal and they talk about how the British Empire has done the righteous thing and protected liberty. Thank heavens we survived that crisis. So they save their words until a little bit later. It's difficult for religious leaders to get behind social protest because they're parts of the establishment.
And one of the salient points in your book on the eve of the revolution, there was still no proto-American religious community or separate American religious community distinct from the imperial system, right?
Absolutely. You know, one of the most important things to think about when we think about religion and the revolution is that religious communities, transatlantic religious communities or transcolonial religious communities were not used to leverage the revolution. Now, that doesn't mean that congregations weren't vital places for organizing. They absolutely were. It's that those structures that they had been using to communicate across the Atlantic, those structures all really served the goals of the empire. So it's very difficult to repurpose them. The rebelling colonists have to create new structures. They have to build new communities across colonies to get people in the United States to think of themselves as Americans. That's a huge project for the colonists in lots of different ways. The people leading the revolution have to create the United States.
Did the revolution bring on an assault on established churches?
No, that's a great question. We often talk about the American Revolution as a time when religious liberty was enshrined, but let's make that specific. When does that happen? How does that happen? So during the Revolution, there is a pretty intense fight against the Church of England, particularly in the southern colonies. Each colony very quickly stops paying for its establishment, things like that. But it's not an anti-religious revolution in the way that the French Revolution is specifically, they go after the Catholic Church in France during the Revolution. The American colonists did not go against the institutions of the church. Instead, they used those institutions to pull them on board into the colonies and then into a sort of a collective into the United States. They don't really fight against the idea of an established church.
So where do Thomas Jefferson and James Madison fit in your story? One reason why I admire Jefferson, he and Madison worked to disestablish the church in Virginia. I guess that was the Church of England. Mm-hmm. Where does that all fit in here?
He's America's Hamlet, right? He's his own thinker on some of these issues. I like Madison, particularly as a practical actor here. Madison, in his memorial and remonstrances, when he's working to disestablish the church in Virginia, working for the Act for Religious Freedom in the 1780s, he writes this great document where he sort of makes a list of reasons why there shouldn't be an establishment. And he's got some great ideas in there for how to think about where it is at that moment. So he talks about competition between churches. He talks about how naturally Christianity will survive without intervention from the state. But what they're imagining as religion is really Protestant Christianity, or maybe extending it to include some Catholics. Maybe some Jews can be around. We're not sure if they can hold office, right? It's a pretty limited understanding of who's going to be in that. But what they do, maybe in some ways inadvertently, is they establish a level of religious freedom that goes far beyond that. And so that kind of opens up this question of a lot more religious diversity than I think they were necessarily anticipating.
Well, that's interesting.
I'm not saying they wouldn't have welcomed it. I'm just saying they didn't necessarily anticipate it.
Oh, and I think that's been a positive development for our country. But the term separation of church and state, it meant something different than it does now. How has that changed over time?
So it's an old phrase, and usually when it was said in the 17th and 18th century, what they were really talking about was separating out the government from the institution of the church. And what they meant was a single church there. But the other piece of this story is that once the Protestant system collapses, Americans find they have no way to recreate it. And I think we need to remember their political limitations. I mean, they're very skilled politicians. They're very thoughtful. And they're very aware of how complicated religion is. And they choose not to try to recreate that system. So the counterfactual is they could have tried to have created a tripartite establishment. Remember, Britain had a bi-confessional state. So you have the Church of Scotland as Presbyterian and the Church of England has bishops as a separate church. So Britain has two established churches. If they had followed the British model, they would have, and the head of state in Britain had to be a Protestant. That was true until, 2015? I think it had to do with after Will and Kate got married or something.
You got me.
Far after my period.
Yeah, I'll take your word for it.
So you have to have a Protestant ruler, and you have this mixed establishment. So the Articles of Confederation or the Constitution, they could have tried to create a system which would have included New England Congregationalists, Presbyterians from the Middle Colonies, and people from the Church of England in the South. And if they had brought those three together, they would have effectively recreated that British system. And they didn't. They never even tried. At no point is there an effort to try to unify the institutional level of the colonies through religion. And I think it's because they knew that what had developed within that Protestant system was already far more diverse. You can't put the genie back in the bottle.
You make an interesting observation here about the start of the war. I'll read it from page 176. The new national government, the Continental Congress, had no long-standing relationship to religious leaders or habits of American national public religion to draw on. There were no legal or institutional connections between the Congress and any ecclesiastical body. You go on to say, despite the dangers it posed to national unity, the power of public religion was too great for the Continental Congress to ignore. What do you mean by that?
Well, so we have some very dramatic moments in the early part of the revolution in 1775 and 1776, really big days of fasting and Thanksgiving when the Congress pulls together. They invite religious leaders from across the board to support their cause. Some religious institutions really get on board with this. So the biggest Presbyterian organization, the Synod of New York and Philadelphia, it says we will support this day of fasting. This is the 75 one. And these are moments when whether people are supporting the revolution or opposing the revolution. You remember, the revolution was probably 30 to 40% of the American population at that moment. It's sort of at its high water mark, are people who are vigorously supporting it. And then you have a lot of people who are just nervous about what is this going to mean for my life if this changes, right? But they have these days of fasting when tons of people, regardless of how they feel about the revolution, are going to churches and hearing sermons about whether their cause is righteous. These are big moments of public religion. And the fact that these are sort of national events lends credibility to the Continental Congress. So the Congress declares these days of fasting. The religious leaders support them. They promulgate them. They preach those sermons. So that's kind of a collaboration. And that's a really powerful moment. But then Congress keeps declaring these moments for quite a while. As the war goes on, people stop following them as much. The chaos is just too great. The war is far too disruptive. And then eventually they stop happening altogether. So the Congress uses this power when they can to really pull people together to try to get the war off the ground. And then the project of the war is long and difficult and grueling, and it ceases to be a useful tool.
Did religious devotion ebb during the American Revolution? It came at the time of the Enlightenment, as we've discussed, in between the two Great Awakening revivalist movements. And the Enlightenment is seen as a time when reason and scientific investigation triumphs over religious superstition and dogmatic beliefs.
You know, I wouldn't juxtapose those in quite that way. I think a lot of deeply religious people would have embraced science, did embrace science. They believed their religion was reasonable, right? In terms of devotion falling away, individual people are going to do their own thing, right? So, and I'm looking at this from the top level down. What you can say is that this is a really disruptive war, and that churches, for instance, really suffer. If we look at church records through the Revolutionary period, often the church books disappear because the church building was burned. They're big buildings, so armies often end up using them. Ministers either have to flee if they're part of the Church of England, or they might become chaplains or something like that. And so there's an absence of clergy. There's tons of economic disruption. So all of that's going to have a huge impact on the historical record. Whether individuals responded to the crises of the war with greater or lesser faith, I think we can look around at the world we live in and ask, have people become more or less religious during COVID? Or do people become more or less religious during Vietnam, right? People are people, right? You're going to see the same differences of human reaction on the ground.
So what's your take on the current debate, the current argument over whether the United States was founded as a Christian nation? My own view is that it was not founded as a Christian nation, but I'd like to hear your view on this.
So what I see as the real lesson of the subject of religion in the revolution is that this conflict over whether the United States is a Christian nation or not, or the place of religion in our public life, it's an argument that's built into our DNA. At the end of the revolution, when the Constitution is being written, you have very vocal people who believe that you have to be a Protestant in order to be a reliable citizen or a reliable member of government. And then you have people who believe that that is impossible. And you have a lot of political actors who see that in practical ways, trying to nail something down is going to be really divisive, and they have to hang together at that moment, right? So because we have all of these different voices there at the founding, we shouldn't be surprised that all those different voices have stayed with us. In the late 1790s and into the early 19th century. So 1798 is when people really get terrified about the Illuminati for the first time, up through, around the end of the War of 1812. There's a real project to create the idea of a Christian nation. There's a historian by the name of Jedediah Morse. He decides to write a providential history of the American Revolution. So he writes to John Adams and he says, tell me what's most important about the revolution. And John Adams writes back and gives him some political, philosophical stuff. And then he says, no, wait. I'm aiming to show how God guided the American Revolution. Right. And then Adams writes back and gives them some places where he thinks religion was important. Those quotes are used all the time. They're from 1815. When you see a John Adams quote from 1815 about religion and the revolution, that's the context. So what's important there is that that's a project that happens about 20 to 30 years after the revolution started, when people are saying, okay, now we've got this country and we've got to make it work. Some of those people want religion to be a big part of that. And others really don't. This is the same time Tom Paine is writing Age of Reason, right? There are other people who are actively opposed to that. Well, go figure. Here, 200 years later, we're having that same argument. We have people who believe that our citizenship is dependent on our being led by Protestant Christians who have a Protestant notion of liberty. And then we have a lot of other people who believe that that is just absolutely not true, and that freedom of religion is an essential part of what it means to be a U.S. citizen. Those beliefs are held with sort of equal vigor. Both have an equal claim to the Revolutionary era.
Well, I've already made my views clear on this. I do not agree with the position that we were founded as a Christian nation. I mentioned at the start of this podcast the Treaty of Tripoli, Article 11, which is often cited as a counter-argument to that. Why don't you put that document into context for us?
That is a perfect document, right? So it's a foreign policy version of the same issue that we see in the founding documents. Religion is often divisive. It's divisive today. It was divisive then. And when you are trying to lead people and you're trying to get people to work together, if you're not confident that the religion you're talking about is going to pull them together, which of course the leaders of the United States could not be confident that that was the case. Certainly when they're writing the Treaty of Tripoli and they're trying to explain that they're not going to, this is the basis of a treaty with a Muslim power. And they want to say, we're not going to fight you on the basis of you being Muslim and us being Christian, right? That we're not going to fight a religious war here. If you can't use religion to bring you together, you need to make it clear that you're not using religion to separate you. In that context, I think you're entirely right. The people who were founding the United States, and by the founders in that sense, I mean the people writing the Constitution and the first years of government, they did not believe that bringing religion into the subject, but that trying to define what a Protestant country would be or a Christian country would be, or even if they should do anything like that, they thought if they tried, it would divide them. They did not leave religion out of the founding documents by mistake. They knew what could happen with disestablishment, and they also knew that any other course of action was going to be too divisive.
And of course, the Constitution makes only one mention of religion, that there shall be no religious tests for office. So a final question for you. When do the established churches in the colonies and then in the new United States finally go extinct?
So there are two really different answers to that question. The simple, straightforward answer is that Massachusetts dismantles its establishment in 1833, and before that, Connecticut in 1818, and sort of gradually over the years before that, disestablishment happens. The more complicated question is that the many ways that religion and the state were intertwined in the colonial era took a really long time to pull apart. And also, people in the early republic were finding new ways to pull them back together, right? People who wanted to pull them together were trying to pull them together. And so we talk a lot about having an informal establishment. Even freedom of religion is a kind of establishment, right? Because it contains a definition of what's religion. What kinds of freedoms do you get to claim based on freedom of religion? Does it include the right to hurt somebody else? Right? Those questions are still being argued about.
Does freedom of religion mean you don't have to bake somebody a certain wedding cake, right?
Or get a vaccine, right? Do you have the right to endanger somebody else because of your faith, right? I will say definitively in the founding era, The answer was absolutely no. All of the freedoms of religion that you see in the colonial era were limited by the security of the state. Religious people had to, the phrase is, demean themselves peaceably. You were only eligible for religious freedom if you were not a danger to others in the state. The idea that you would be able to hurt somebody else based on your religious freedom is antithetical to 18th century religious freedom ideas.
Katherine Carté, author of Religion and the American Revolution. I'm sure you've given all our listeners something to think about, regardless where they stand on these issues. On the next episode of History as It Happens, are we reliving the 1850s?
Pelosi has created a sham process.
That bloody decade before the Civil War seems to be speaking to us today as Democrats and Republicans fight over the meaning of the January 6th violence at the U.S. Capitol. Political violence and competing narratives. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.